To truly understand the indestructibility of Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez, one cannot simply begin with the Vietnam War. The steel in his spine was forged long before he ever donned a Green Beret. It was hammered into existence by the brutal realities of the South Texas brush country and the ancient, defiant bloodline of his ancestors. Born on August 5, 1935, in the tiny, dust-choked hamlet of Lindenau near Cuero in DeWitt County, Texas, Roy was the child of two worlds that America had largely forgotten or actively suppressed. His father, Salvador Benavidez Jr., was a Mexican-American sharecropper, a man whose life was measured in the weight of cotton sacks and the mercy of the rain. The Benavidez family had deep roots in the region, descendants of the settlers who founded Benavidez, Texas in the 1830s. They were Tejanos, people of the land who had weathered revolutions, border wars, and the shifting tides of political power. But it was his mother, Teresa Perez, who bequeathed to him a heritage of fierce, quiet resistance. She was a Yaqui Indian. The Yaqui people of the Sonoran Desert are legendary in the annals of North American history for their warrior culture. For centuries, they resisted the Spanish conquistadors, the Mexican government, and anyone else who sought to tame them. They were known for an almost supernatural endurance, a stoicism in the face of pain, and a refusal to surrender that bordered on the suicidal. This genetic inheritance, the blood of the Yaqui, would become the defining trait of Roy Benavidez's life. It was a latent power, waiting for the crucible of war to activate it. The 1930s in rural Texas were a time of crushing economic despair. The Great Depression had hollowed out the American economy, and for minority families in the South, the collapse was catastrophic. The Benavidez family lived a precarious existence, laboring in the fields from dawn until dusk. But poverty was not their only enemy. Disease was a constant, spectral presence in the cramped, underserved communities of the Rio Grande Valley. When Roy was just 2 years old, the shadow of tuberculosis, the White Plague, fell over their home. The bacterial infection, thriving in the dust and malnutrition of the era, claimed the life of his father, Salvador. Teresa, a woman of immense fortitude, fought to keep her family together, remarrying in an attempt to provide stability. But the disease was relentless. 5 years after burying her first husband, Teresa also succumbed to tuberculosis. At the age of 7, Roy Benavidez stood at the graveside of the only world he had ever known, holding the hand of his younger brother, Roger. They were orphans in a hard land. The boys were taken in by their grandfather, uncle, and aunt in El Campo, Texas. The household was already overflowing with 8 cousins, a testament to the cultural imperative of familia, the unbreakable bond that demanded kin care for kin, no matter the cost. There was no question of state care. The family simply absorbed the blow, stretching their meager rations of beans and tortillas to feed 2 more mouths. Roy's education was not found in books, but in the brutal rhythm of the harvest. The family operated as a migrant labor unit, following the crops across the American West. They moved like nomads, traveling from the humid, mosquito-infested cotton fields of Texas to the sugar beet farms of Colorado. It was backbreaking, sun-scorched labor that began before the sun rose and ended only when the light failed. Roy learned early that pain was just a sensation to be ignored, and that quitting was a luxury the poor could not afford. Formal schooling was a sporadic interruption to his work. He attended classes only when the harvest allowed, often missing months at a time. This transient existence, combined with the language barriers and systemic neglect of the segregated school system, meant Roy was frequently left behind. He was a teenager in elementary-level classes, surrounded by younger children, a target for mockery. The sting of the racial epithets, greaser, dumb Mexican, was a daily humiliation, but the Yaqui blood did not allow him to hang his head. Roy fought back. He became known as a scrapper, a boy who would unleash a fury of fists against anyone who disrespected him or his family. At 15, tired of the fighting and the shame, he dropped out of school to work full-time, shining shoes at the bus station and working in a tire shop, resigned to a life of manual labor. But every time he looked at the horizon, he felt a pull toward something greater, a destiny that lay beyond the cotton fields. As the sun set on his childhood, the fires of a distant war in Korea began to burn, offering an escape. Fast forward to the morning of May 2nd in 1968. The red clay earth of Loc Ninh, South Vietnam, was already baking under the tropical sun. For Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez, now a hardened veteran of the 5th Special Forces Group, the day began with a ritual of peace amidst the machinery of war. He was a devout Catholic, and amidst the sandbags and artillery of the Forward Operating Base, FOB, he found a quiet corner to pray. He prayed for his wife, Lala, and his children back in Texas. He prayed for the men of his unit, Detachment B-56. The atmosphere at Loc Ninh was tense. The base was a launchpad for the secret war, the clandestine operations conducted by MAC-V SOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. These men, the Green Berets, were tasked with the impossible, venturing into the neutral territories of Cambodia and Laos to disrupt the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, supply lines on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was dangerous, deniable work. If you died across the border, your country might not acknowledge you were ever there. As Roy finished his prayers and moved toward the Tactical Operations Center, TOC, the static of the radio shattered the morning calm. The voice on the other end was frantic, tight with the terror of imminent death. It was the voice of a panicked radio man from a 12-man reconnaissance team that had inserted earlier that morning. "Get us out of here. Get us out. We're taking heavy fire." The team, led by Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright, a close friend of Benavidez, had unknowingly dropped into a nightmare. They had inserted directly into the staging area of a massive NVA infantry battalion. 12 men were now trapped in a small jungle clearing, surrounded by nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers. Benavidez watched from the flight line as the first wave of rescue helicopters returned, riddled with bullet holes. The pilots were shaken, their faces pale. The Greyhounds, the 240th Assault Helicopter Company, had tried to extract the team, but the volume of anti-aircraft fire was too intense. They had been driven back, their hulls smashed by heavy machine gun fire, their crews wounded. The consensus on the flight line was grim. The landing zone, Untold, was a suicide trap. Going back in was impossible. But Roy Benavidez was listening to the radio. He heard the screams of his friends. He heard the reports of casualties. Wright was hit. Mousseau was hit. He knew that without immediate help, every man on that ground would be dead within minutes. Something in Benavidez snapped. Or, perhaps, something locked into place. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't even grab his M16 rifle. Clad only in his green fatigue pants and a t-shirt, clutching a medical aid bag in one hand and with a heavy Bowie knife strapped to his belt, and, according to some accounts, carrying a tomahawk he had used in training for close-quarters improvisation, he ran toward a returning helicopter that was preparing for one last desperate attempt. "I'm coming with you," he yelled over the roar of the rotors. The pilot, Warrant Officer Larry McKibben, saw the wild determination in the Master Sergeant's eyes and nodded. Benavidez jumped aboard the Slick, a Huey transport helicopter. He checked his gear, a bag of bandages, morphine, his knife, and the fierce resolve of a man who had decided that death was preferable to abandoning a comrade. The helicopter lifted off, banking sharply toward the Cambodian border. As they approached the coordinates, the sky ahead turned black with smoke. Tracers, green and red, crisscrossed the air like angry hornets. The noise of the battle rose up to meet them, a deafening roar of automatic weapons and exploding mortars. The pilot struggled to find a gap in the canopy, but the enemy fire was a solid wall. There was no place to land. Benavidez spotted a small patch of elephant grass about 75 yards from the team's smoke signal. It was too far. It was across open ground swept by machine guns. It was suicide. "Put me down there," Benavidez shouted, pointing to the clearing. The helicopter flared, hovering 10 feet above the uneven ground. The door gunners laid down, suppressing fire, but the return fire pinged off the fuselage, shattering the plexiglass. Roy Benavidez stood on the skids. He took a breath of the acrid, cordite-filled air. He looked down at the jungle that was waiting to swallow him. He tightened his grip on the medical bag. And then he jumped. The jungle floor rushed up to meet him, and the world dissolved into chaos. To understand why Benavidez jumped into that firestorm in 1968, we must rewind 3 years to his first tour of duty. In 1965, Staff Sergeant Benavidez was a young, ambitious Green Beret advisor attached to an ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam Regiment. The mission was different then. Less about secret cross-border raids and more about stiffening the spines of the South Vietnamese infantry. During a routine patrol in the dense jungle canopy, disaster struck with the sudden dull thump of a landmine. The explosion was a thunderclap that erased the world. Benavidez was thrown through the air, his body ragdolled by the concussive force. When he woke, the silence of the jungle had been replaced by the sterile hum of a hospital ward at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. The doctors stood over his bed with grim faces. The diagnosis was a professional death sentence. His spine was fractured. The nerves were damaged. He was paralyzed from the waist down. The medical board at Brooke Army Medical Center, BAMC, in San Antonio, where he was eventually transferred, was unanimous. He would never walk again. The Army began the administrative paperwork to discharge him. He was to be sent home to El Campo, a cripple at 30, his career as a warrior over before it had truly begun. For a man like Roy, whose identity was forged in physical capability and the pride of the airborne, this was a fate worse than death. He lay in his bed, listening to the news reports on the television, protests, flag burnings, the escalating conflict in Vietnam. He felt a burning shame and a furious desire to return to his brothers. What followed was a secret war, fought in the dark confines of the hospital ward. Benavidez refused to accept the doctor's verdict. He began a nightly ritual that became the stuff of legend among the other patients. Every night, after lights out, when the nurses had retreated to their stations, Benavidez would drag himself out of bed. His legs were dead weight, useless anchors dragging behind him. Using only his elbows and his chin, he would crawl across the cold linoleum floor toward the wall. Tears of agony would stream down his face as the movement sent shockwaves of pain through his fractured spine. Reaching the wall, he would use his arms to prop himself up, straining until the veins in his neck bulged, trying to force a signal, any signal, from his brain to his legs. He would stand there, trembling, sweating, like a broken marionette, wiggling his toes for hours. The other patients, many of them amputees or burn victims, became his silent sentries. They would whisper warnings if the staff approached, helping him scramble back into bed. They watched in awe as the mean Mexican fought his own body with the same ferocity he used against the enemy. Months passed. The pain was constant, a white-hot fire in his back. But slowly, sensation returned. Then a twitch, then a step. In July 1966, the day of his medical discharge hearing, arrived. Benavidez was wheeled into the room where the officers sat with the papers that would end his service. They expected him to sign and leave in his wheelchair. Instead, Roy Benavidez stood up. With his wife, Lala, watching, he walked toward the board. He didn't shuffle, he marched. He walked to the center of the room, snapped a crisp salute, and said, "I am not leaving. I am fit for duty." The officers were stunned. The paperwork was torn up, but the Army was not easily convinced. They sent him back to Fort Bragg, not to a desk, but to the grinder. He had to re-qualify for the Special Forces. He had conquered his own body, but the war was waiting to test his soul. The Roy Benavidez who returned to Fort Bragg was different from the one who had left. He carried a secret. His back still hurt, every day. The pain was a constant companion. a reminder of the fragility of the human frame. But he hid it. He woke up early to stretch, he took extra aspirin, and he pushed harder than the young recruits fresh out of boot camp. To prove his fitness, he had to complete the rigorous airborne operations and physical training of the Green Berets. He ran 10 miles a day with a rucksack. He jumped out of planes, the impact of the landing sending jolts of agony up his spine. He grit his teeth and smiled. He was back in the Brotherhood. By January 1968, Benavidez was back in Vietnam. This time, he was assigned to Detachment B-56 of the 5th Special Forces Group. He was a Master Sergeant now, a lifer, a father figure to the younger soldiers. It was during this time that he fully embraced his call sign, Tango Mike Mike. In the phonetic alphabet, TMM stood for That Mean Mexican. It was a moniker born from the racial taunts of his childhood, reclaimed and polished into a badge of honor. It signaled to everyone, friend and foe alike, that this was a man who would not be stopped. His new posting at Loc Ninh was on the bleeding edge of the war. This was the domain of Emakvisog, where the rules of engagement were murky and the missions were perilous. They worked with the Montagnards, the indigenous hill tribes of Vietnam. The Yards, as the Americans called them, were fierce warriors who despised the North Vietnamese and were fiercely loyal to the Green Berets. Roy felt a kinship with them. Their marginalized status and warrior ethos echoed his own Yaqui heritage. Life at the Phobie was a mix of boredom and terror. They ran reconnaissance missions into Cambodia, crossing the fence to spy on the NVA sanctuaries. They tapped phone lines, captured prisoners, and called in airstrikes. It was high-stakes poker played with automatic weapons. Among the men at Loc Ninh was Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright. Wright and Benavidez were close, sharing the bond of men who have seen the worst of humanity and survived. They talked about their families, their plans for after the war, and the heavy burden of leadership. Benavidez respected Wright as a cool-headed tactician. When Wright was assigned to lead the recon team on May 2nd, Benavidez felt a pang of unease. The intelligence reports were bad. There was too much movement across the border. The stage was set for a tragedy, but the actors did not yet know their lines. While Benavidez was at the base praying, Leroy Wright's 12-man team, 3 Americans, Wright, Lloyd Frenchy Mousseau, and radio man Brian O'Connor, and 9 Montagnards, was inserting into the target area. The helicopter insertion went smoothly, almost too smoothly. This was a classic NVA tactic. Bait the trap. Let the Americans land, let the helicopters leave, and then close the noose. The team moved silently through the dense undergrowth, the triple canopy jungle filtering the sunlight into a green twilight. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. Suddenly, the point man froze. He signaled freeze to the team. They had walked into a hornet's nest. They were not facing a stray patrol. They had landed in the middle of a reinforced NVA base camp. The enemy was everywhere, in the trees, in spider holes, behind fortified bunkers. The first shot was the crack of an AK-47, followed instantly by the roar of hundreds of weapons. The team was pinned down in a small clearing taking fire from 360 degrees. Within seconds, the team was being chewed apart. Wright screamed orders, trying to organize a perimeter. Mousseau was hit in the shoulder. One of the Montagnards was killed instantly. The air was filled with the snap hiss of bullets and the earth-shaking thumps of mortars walking closer to their position. Wright grabbed the radio handset. "Mayday! Mayday! We are surrounded! Heavy contact!" They fought back with the ferocity of trapped animals. They threw grenades, fired their Car-15s until the barrels glowed red, and called in air support. But the NVA were too close, hugging the belt, making it difficult for the jets to bomb without hitting the team. The first extraction attempt by the helicopters failed. The team watched in horror as their ride home was driven off by heavy anti-aircraft fire. Hope began to drain away with their ammunition. Wright was hit again, this time mortally. As he lay dying, he passed the radio to O'Connor. The team leader was gone. The survivors were bleeding out. The enemy was closing in for the final kill, fixing bayonets. And then, through the roar of the gunfire, they heard the thumping of a single rotor blade returning. Roy Benavidez leaped from the skids of the hovering helicopter. He hit the ground rolling, the momentum carrying him forward. The impact jarred his teeth, but he didn't stop. He was 75 yards from the team, separated by a gauntlet of enemy fire. He began to run. It was a sprint through the underworld. The NVA gunners saw the lone figure charging across the open ground and shifted their fire. The air around him snapped with the sonic boom of passing rounds. Within seconds, he was hit. An AK-47 bullet tore through his right leg, spinning him around. He fell, gritted his teeth, and scrambled back up. A moment later, a grenade exploded nearby, peppering his face and neck with shrapnel. Blood poured into his eyes, blinding him. He wiped it away with a forearm and kept running. He crashed into the team's perimeter like a force of nature. The scene was apocalyptic. Wright was dead. Mousseau was holding his intestines in with his hands. O'Connor was severely wounded. 4 of the Montagnards were dead. Benavidez took charge immediately. "We're going home," he roared, his voice cutting through the din. "Get up and fight." He dragged the wounded into a tighter circle. He grabbed an AK-47 from a dead enemy soldier and distributed ammunition to the survivors. He was a whirlwind of motion, exposing himself to fire to direct the air support. He called the jets in "danger close," the napalm strikes searing the hair on their arms, pushing the NVA back just enough to breathe. A rescue helicopter finally braved the fire to land. Benavidez began the agonizing task of loading the wounded. He carried Mousseau. He dragged O'Connor. He went back for the bodies of the Montagnards, refusing to leave them behind. As the helicopter prepared to lift off, heavy machine gun fire raked the cockpit. The pilot was killed instantly. The aircraft lurched, rotor blades clipping the trees, and crashed heavily into the jungle floor, flipping onto its side. The rescue vehicle was now a burning coffin. Benavidez, who was providing covering fire on the ground, ran toward the wreck. He pulled the wounded men out of the twisted metal, dragging them away moments before the fuel tanks exploded. The battle raged on. The sun began to set. Benavidez was bleeding from the stomach, the back, the legs. He was sustaining himself on adrenaline and pure will. The NVA, frustrated by this unkillable demon, mounted a human wave attack. As a second extraction helicopter hovered low, Benavidez was ferrying a wounded man to the door. Suddenly, an NVA soldier broke through the smoke, swinging a rifle butt at Benavidez's head. The blow shattered Benavidez's jaw. The enemy soldier lunged with a bayonet, slashing Roy's arms. Benavidez had no rifle in his hands. He reached for his belt. In a primal, violent struggle, he grabbed the enemy's bayonet blade with his hand, slicing his palm, and pulled the soldier in. With his other hand, he drove his Bowie knife into the soldier, ending the threat. Legends say he may have used a tomahawk in the fray. A weapon of his ancestors he carried for luck, but it was the knife that delivered the final strike. He shoved the body away and killed 2 more approaching enemies with a discarded AK-47. He made one last sweep of the perimeter to ensure the classified codes and every single man, living or dead, was accounted for. Only when the last survivor was aboard did he allow himself to be pulled into the helicopter. As they lifted off, his body finally gave out. He was holding his own intestines in with his hands, his blood pooling on the floor of the chopper. Back at the base, the scene was chaotic. The doctors were overwhelmed. Benavidez, motionless and caked in dried blood and mud, was pronounced dead. As the orderlies began to zip him into a black rubber body bag, Benavidez heard the zipper. He tried to move, but his body was paralyzed by shock. He summoned the last spark of life in his soul. He couldn't speak. He couldn't lift a hand. So he gathered the blood and saliva in his mouth and spat directly into the doctor's face. The doctor recoiled. "He's alive!" Roy Benavidez survived 37 separate bullet, bayonet, and shrapnel wounds. He fought for years to receive the Medal of Honor, a process delayed because the Army thought there were no living witnesses to his heroism. It wasn't until 1980 that Brian O'Connor, the radio man he saved, was found living in Fiji. O'Connor had read a newspaper article in Australia about Benavidez and wrote a 10-page report confirming the events. On February 24, 1981, President Ronald Reagan placed the Medal of Honor around the neck of Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez. "If the story of his heroism were a movie script," Reagan said, "you would not believe it." Roy Benavidez was the warrior who ran into hell with a knife and a prayer and walked back out carrying his brothers.